Welcome back to another episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today's guest is Shaun Galanos. Shaun is a love coach, the host of the Love Drive podcast, and an online course creator. He teaches intimacy and communication tools for better relationships and more love. In this episode, we discuss how to know if someone is a solid potential partner for you, why you shouldn't start to date if you are in a negative headspace, how to tell if you are falling in love too quickly, why you shouldn't overshare when you first start dating someone, how to know if it's time to break up with someone, what to do if your view of love and romance is jaded, how to know if you or someone is emotionally unavailable, common themes of long-term healthy relationships, and so much more. So let's get this conversation going and welcome Shaun Galanos to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Shaun, welcome to the podcast.
So happy to be here, Doug. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. And you're somebody who's an expert on relationships, on love, on dating. And I think you've gained so much respect in this field, not only through helping other people, but through your own experience as well. And my first question for you is that you've had a lot of experience, both dating and then also coaching people. You drove a cab for a living and you would ask, the people who got in your car about their love life. So you heard a lot of stories, you heard a lot of experiences, and that's allowed you to cultivate, I'm sure, a lot of ideas and values about the subject of dating and love in your mind. But let's just say that you had to start over. You knew nothing about dating now. Like knowing what you know now, like if you were to start dating tomorrow, let's just say for the sake of it, you're not in any kind of relationship. Like, how would you do things differently?
I think two things that are really important to consider. I have a lot of clients who are just fresh out of a divorce, right? Or who are widowed or who haven't dated in 20 years. So they've got no idea of the current landscape, right? So assuming you haven't dated in 20 years and you're ready to get back out there, two things that I want you to keep in mind, or two things that I would tell myself, right? The younger me, is that you can absolutely ask for what you want. I think I started this because when I was younger, I didn't understand why I couldn't just be honest about what I wanted. And when I was much younger, what I really wanted was sex. And I felt like I couldn't just say, I'm only available for a sexual connection, because I thought that people would label me a dog or creepy or whatever, when in reality, there's also a lot of people who just want sex. Right? Or there's a lot of people who want a serious relationship, or who want to explore some weird kink, or who want whatever you want. So instead of pretending like you want a relationship when you really want sex, or pretending like you only really want sex when you want a relationship, right? Because there are people that think that the way to attract a partner is to have sex with them and to play it cool, right? Oh, I'm like only looking for something casual, when really their deep down inside desire is for a relationship. You can totally lead with that. This is what I'm looking for. And then you find the other person that also wants that. And anybody else who doesn't want that, they just are not a fit, right? So that's one thing, is be honest with what you're looking for. And I know you might be thinking, oh, well, every time I've done that, they've used that to get exactly what they want, and then they've left, right? So I hear from a lot of women that say, if I'm honest about the fact that I really want a relationship, and if I say that to a man, the man will say, oh, that's also what I want, when really they only want sex, and they're going to use you, and they're going to use that to have sex, and then they're going to leave. And to that I say, those types of people will always do whatever they can to get what they want, right? And so it's an unfortunate byproduct of dating, is that you're going to meet people who just aren't the nicest, kindest, loving people. And we can talk later about how to identify kind, loving people. The second thing that I'll say is that try as much as possible to not let strangers affect how you feel about yourself, right? When you're dating, you're essentially identifying strangers to like see if they're a good fit for a relationship. And some of those people are going to reject you. Some of those people are going to be mean. Some of those people are going to ghost you. And please try not to let what are essentially strangers affect how you feel about yourself, your self-worth, your self-esteem, your self-respect. The people that should rightfully affect that are people that are close to you, your loved ones, not total strangers. So those are the two things that I would tell my younger self if I was starting to date.
And thanks for sharing that. I want to dive into both those things, because actually, like, I polled my audience and I was like, hey, like, I'm interviewing Shaun, like what are some questions you might have? And one question that came through was, and I think this happens probably, I would say it's common, but I think like your example where somebody, hasn't dated in a while, they just got divorced, they went through something kind of traumatic and they're looking to put themselves back out there, that they instantly may become like infatuated or in quote unquote love with somebody new because it's something completely new. They are in a place where they're not feeling totally secure or in a place where they're feeling too great about themselves. And so this idea of this person comes along and they end up communicating with this other person what they want. That other person validates that's like, oh, you like chocolate chip ice cream? I like chocolate chip ice cream. You're looking for marriage? I'm looking for marriage. You're a Christian? I'm a Christian. And then they're like, wow, I found my person. And where I'm going with this is this. It's kind of alluding to what you said. How does somebody not get trapped in that trap to where like, how can somebody tell if that person is actually for real and being able to like calm their like love hormones down a little bit so that they can still maintain some sense of logic as they're growing that relationship?
It's really hard. I just want to recognize that it's really, really hard. If you are falling for someone, there is very little that you can do to stop that from happening. Every time I've fallen hard for someone, there's a part of me that knows that this is probably not the wisest thing to do. And not because the relationships didn't end up being loving and kind and work out, but you don't know how it's going to play out, right? And so there was a logical piece of me saying, okay, man, you're kind of you're on thin ice here. You have the chance of getting hurt in this scenario. And what I always tell myself is like, I will always choose love. I will always choose. I'm a hopeful romantic. I probably didn't get into this business for no reason. I like falling, right? And I've fallen a couple times in my life, and I'm probably not going to stop myself from falling. And there's very little that you can actually do. What I want people to do is to not ignore the unhealthy behaviors or patterns or red flags that you might see in the early stages of falling for somebody, right? And it can be really tempting to ignore those red flags and to ignore having a conversation about those red flags, because the feeling is if I honest about what I'm seeing, this thing might go away, right? This thing might affect these loving feelings, which feel a lot like a drug because it's a release of all sorts of, hormones and norepinephrine and serotonin and dopamine. And we are hedonistic. We really are. And it's really hard to stop that once it's started. So don't ignore the red flags. And if you feel like this is love bombing, right, which is sort of like getting a lot of loving attention and words and promises from someone who's essentially a stranger, you can even talk about that with the person, saying, hey, I think I'm falling for you. And it's kind of scary because I've been hurt in my past and I don't want to get hurt again. And I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here. So talking about the relationship, talking about falling in love while you're falling in love is not going to ruin the mood. If that causes them to run, they're not for you. If bringing up a red flag about something that you've noticed while you're falling in love makes them run, well, they are not the kind, loving person that you thought they were, right? So how do people respond when you bring up either red flags or the fact that you're falling with someone is something that I would recommend.
Right. And you mentioned that you felt like you've known that at times, even like looking back or even in the moment, that you were on like thin ice, like getting into a relationship too quick or falling too quick. And thanks for sharing that, because I think a lot of us, I've struggled with it. I think we've all at some point struggled with that. But what are some of the symptoms of that, so that like if somebody is experiencing this, they can take a step back and maybe start to have a different conversation with their partner, whether it's they're able to, get some of their logic sense back and they can see some red flags that they can have a conversation about, or just being even open and honest about the fact that they think that they are falling too quick?
I mean, some steps are that like you can't stop thinking about them. You're spending more than average time talking to them. You prioritize connecting with them over other people that you used to have more of a connection with. I think what's important in this stage, in the sort of infatuation stage of dating and relationships, which is, by the way, it's an important stage of relational development. It creates a bond, right? That infatuation stage bonds you to the other person, not in a traumatic way. A lot of people talk about trauma bond, and this is different than that. It allows you to stay connected to this person and feel a deep sense of connection with this person, so that when things do arise, when there is conflict or friction, there's enough glue to keep you together. And you go, oh yeah, this is a good thing. This is not a perfect thing. There are no perfect things. This is now becoming a little bit more challenging. We have some work to do here. And yet there's enough of a connection here for me to want to continue to do this. So I think one of the things that you want to keep in mind is to, as much as possible, stay connected in the other areas of your life that you had a connection with before you met this person. Continue doing the work that's important to you. Continue spending time with friends and family. Continue working out. Continue volunteering and doing all that other stuff, because if that person leaves, and they do, right? They do leave sometimes. You're not left with nothing. You have safety nets. You have routines. You have things that you do that keep you grounded and that keep you connected to something bigger than this relationship.
You brought up something that is so important. And I think it reminds me a lot of like drug addiction. And I know you're also in recovery, in that if you notice when somebody is so far down the addiction cycle, nothing else matters but that thing, right? And I think that's similar to what you're describing, in that you'll know if like you're in a unhealthy, slippery slope towards falling in love with a certain person, when that becomes like your drug, like you said, where you've like lost focus of anything else other than that one thing. And I think that's a great thing to keep in mind. You mentioned something else about like you've always like found a way to lead with love and you're a hopeless romantic. And I think a lot of times when people are getting into a relationship or they're beginning to date, a lot of times they're angry or they're saddened or they're broken in some ways they feel, and that it's hard for them to transition back into a place of love because of maybe they just got out of a relationship where they were incredibly hurt. Maybe their mindset is just told them that they're never going to find love, they're not worthy. What have been some of your best practices personally that whenever you've gotten into a place where you felt angry or upset or hurt in terms of relationships, where you've been able to kind of take some time to heal that, and then like how have you been able to come back out from a place of love?
Yeah, those spaces are very difficult spaces to date from. If you're feeling jaded, if you're feeling upset, if you're heartbroken, if you're angry, your preferred gender, if you think that you're going to be alone forever, those are not really helpful, conducive spaces to connect from. I've always found myself that when I'm feeling like desperate for connection, that is the worst place for me to be, like on a dating app swiping, right? Because just the energy, you can feel it. It's just, I'm not even out there to connect. I'm out there to feel better about myself. And I think a lot of people use dating apps as a form of external validation, and we all need a little bit of it, But if you are matching consistently with people and not chatting with them, it means that you're not interested in actually connecting or meeting anybody. So if you find yourself in one of these sort of grabby spaces, where you're just like kind of grabbing for anything to make yourself feel better, just know that that is probably not going to be the salve that you need for your wound, right? What you probably need is a lot of self-care, a lot of probably therapy, a lot of time, some yoga, some like time spent really sitting with your discomfort, your despair, your sadness, your anger, so that you can start like processing that stuff before you bring that energy to a relationship. And I'm not saying you need to be fully healed before you love someone. Not at all. We can meet people in all stages of our development or the work that we're doing. But if you're in a fairly negative space, it's not going to be a very conducive space to be connecting from.
Right. And I would also imagine that if, like you mentioned, the two things that you would tell your younger self if you were like day one dating again. And the first thing is don't be afraid to like, ask for what you want. Right. And the second thing was to not let your self-esteem necessarily be impacted by strangers. Right. And I would imagine that if you were able to have some level of self-awareness around like your mental state when you are going through a breakup or you're in that in-between phase, that you're able to understand that if you're able to work on yourself and get to a place where you're back feeling some level of security within yourself, that the stranger's ability to impact your self-esteem will become less and less the more secure you become with yourself, right? And with all that to say, I think a lot of people, when they get back into that initial stage of dating, we've touched on this a little bit, but I want to dive deeper, is they struggle with communication. They struggle with asking for what they want. They struggle with identifying what they want in a relationship. Like, what is some advice that you would give some of the listeners if they're trying to learn how to communicate effectively? Like, what are some tips that you might share?
That's a good question. I mean, I like the idea of first figuring out what it is that you want when you're dating. And a lot of people don't, like they just don't know. And I think that going on a few dates is a great way to figure out what it is that you want. It's okay to not know exactly what you want. I remember when I was dating I had on my profile, I wrote casually looking for something serious, which I really liked because it said, this is what I'm actually looking for, but I'm not tied to this, to you being the person that I'm going to have a serious relationship with, right? This is the result that I want, but I'm willing to let go of the timeline, right? So spend some time dating to figure out what it is that you're looking for. Also, I was just going to say, be honest about what you want. And that is the problem with communication, is that people have a really hard time being honest. I get a lot of feedback about my work that I am brutally honest. And in my opinion, I don't find myself to be brutally honest. I think we're just not used to hearing honesty. And so it sounds brutal. Like, it sounds brutal for people to say things like, I'm not looking to have sex with anybody until at least like the seventh date, right? People just don't understand that that is just like a regular request for a preference, right? I think what people need to do ultimately is not be scared of rejection, because I think that's the one thing keeping us from being honest, right? Is the fact that if I'm honest about what I want or what I'm looking for, or what I'm not getting in my relationship, they are going to leave or I'm going to hurt their feelings, right? And rejection, in my opinion, is liberating. If they leave because I've expressed in a kind, loving way a request, then that person is not for me. And I would much rather you know that sooner rather than later. So I don't know if that was helpful. It's hard to tell people exactly how to communicate.
Yeah, but I think you kind of summed it up. Like, you have to eventually get to a place where you know what you want in a relationship, and that comes either from you identifying it through self-discovery before you go into it. It comes from going on some dates and gaining some experience. It comes from, I don't know, having conversation with a therapist. Like, there's many ways, I think, to get there, right? Like you said, and then being able to communicate like what you want, and not only communicating what you want, but sticking with it is like the hard part, like you said, and being able to walk away when something's not serving you. And I was just going to say, and I think sometimes people, not sometimes, I know a lot of people, including myself, struggle with when they're in a relationship and now you've kind of like, you've gone deeper than you probably should have in a relationship. And you get to that place where that gut feeling that you had initially starts to become louder and louder and louder and louder, to where you're like, gosh, I'm not going to be able to change this person like I thought I could, or this person is just not for me. And I'm having like a hard time, like knowing whether or not I should continue to put in work into this relationship, or we should just break up. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how does somebody know like when it's time to actually, end a relationship or walk away, or whether there's some more work that needs to be done?
It's so hard. It's like such a hard place to be. I've been there before. I've been in relationships with people that on paper were amazing, right? Amazing. And anybody on the outside would say, you're insane for leaving this relationship. This is a great relationship. And I remember having a job in sales some 15 years ago that was on paper amazing, right? It paid me a great salary. I didn't have to work too hard. I got a lot of freedom from it, but my soul was not lit up. My soul was kind of like shriveling up like a little raisin. And I made the decision to leave, not knowing whether it was going to be the right decision, right? I think I learned this in 12-step recovery, that there are no mistakes in God's world, because whatever you do will lead to something else. And when I left that great job, eventually it led me to being a love coach and to having this conversation with you today, Doug, right? And if I hadn't done that, we wouldn't be here. I'd have some other trajectory. So I kind of look at life that way, is that sometimes you just need to make a decision about whether you're going to stay and whether you're going to go. And this is more of sort of like more of an amorphous answer, more of a spiritual answer, that ultimately no one can tell you what the right thing to do is. You're going to have to do some soul searching, some gut feeling, what do I really want in my heart? Is this relationship, is this ultimately going to lead to like a happy heart, right? That's the more spiritual answer. The more pragmatic answer is, are my needs getting met, right? Are like a good amount of my needs getting met? Not all of them, because it's impossible for anyone to meet all of your needs, and it would be unreasonable for you to think that your partner can be that person for you. So are enough of my needs being met? And if some of them aren't being met and they're quite important, am I actually talking to my partner about this? Am I saying, hey, actually, I need a little bit more space in my relationship. I'm feeling sometimes it feels a little claustrophobic and I want to stay connected to you. But when we spend so much time together, I feel anxious. And so what I would love is a little bit more space. So that's an example of how you can make a request. But basically, are you making requests for your needs to be met? And are you asking your partner how you can meet some of their needs as well? So, are there conversations that are not being had about needs or resolving conflict or what might lead to a more fulfilling relationship, or some of these like red flags or behavior modifications? Or are we sweeping all this stuff out under the rug and not talking about what needs to be talked about? So those are two ways of identifying whether it's time to go or it's time to like dig your heels in and do a little bit more work.
Right. And I want to dive into that a little bit more and talk about some proactive things that people can do, because I think people might be listening to this and maybe they're in this position now, or they want to prevent themselves from being in this position down the road. And they're like, all right, well, like, how do I actually identify what I need in a relationship? Like, we've talked about what people want. Like, you talked about casually looking for something serious. And I think people, when they get into a relationship, hopefully they both agree on what they want initially and they've had that conversation. But as far as like emotional needs, like, sexual needs in a relationship, all these things are so important. How do you advise people to begin to like discover what their actual emotional needs are, so that way if they're in a position where they're having to, question whether or not their needs are being met, they actually know what those needs are?
Yeah, so it's funny because all the questions you've asked me, I have whole courses on this stuff. I have a course on emotional availability. I have a course called Getting Your Needs Met. I have one called Healthy Communication. They're chock full of all these things. And the first thing that popped to mind for me is there is a tool called the Nonviolent Communication Needs Inventory. And it's literally a list, and you can add it in the show notes, a list of needs, right? Connection, safety, play, rest, communication. And there's like 100 needs on this thing. And some of them, you'll read this list and you'll go, 80 of these I don't really care about. I don't really care about all these, but these 20 are really, really important to me. And how is my partner able to help meet some of these needs? So that's one thing. One thing is to look at the NVC needs inventory. And what that does, it gives you language to stuff that we don't talk about, right? There's no relationship education in this country or in a lot of different countries. We're just starting now to do more socio-emotional learning in schools. But for the most part, we didn't receive this. We didn't get it from our parents growing up or our caretakers growing up. So the idea of having language, developing language around needs to a lot of us is quite foreign, right? So that's one tool that you can use to start figuring it out. And then the other is like, when there's something missing in your relationship, when there's friction or conflict in your relationship. And there is some soul searching that has to happen around, okay, when I feel this, I'm missing this, right? So when I feel angry that my partner is consistently late for dinner, what I actually need is consideration. I want them to let me know that they're going to be late, or I want them to make more of an effort to show up on time, or I want them to say, hey, you know what? 6 is not going to work for me. At 7 o'clock is better, right? So more communication or more consideration. So we have to go underneath one layer. There's the emotion that's going to either create the fight or the conflict, right? Anger, sadness, whatever. But then underneath it, what's the need that's not being met? It's something. It's always something, right? The emotion is the thing that signifies that there's some work that needs to be done or there's something that's missing.
Right. And I think in order to actually get to a place where you're able to understand what your own emotional needs are, you really have to get to know yourself on like a deeper level and be totally comfortable with who you are. And that's something that I really admire in yourself, where you've not only been sober for quite some time, but you got diagnosed with herpes not too long ago, and you're very open about that. And first, I want to commend you for being so open and vulnerable, because that's not an easy subject to talk about. I have some people that I know that have it, that it's completely crushed them for a long time, and they're mortified to talk about it. So what I want to ask is, how did you get to a place where you were just so comfortable with yourself? Like, what was that process like, to where it allowed you to just not give a crap what other people thought of you having that, and that you just felt so cool, calm, and collected in your own skin?
I think that's the cool, calm, and collected is the exterior version that I'm presenting. I was totally freaked out and devastated and really just kind of like, I didn't feel great about it. And I was diagnosed like a year and a half ago, and it was a pretty dark moment. I just moved to Flagstaff. I was staying in a hotel. I was vaping nicotine mango juice. It was not fun. And I think one of the things that I benefit from is that I also was diagnosed or had like HPV when I was 16. So I got like warts, genital warts from one of the first people I ever slept with. And so for the first 3 years of my like sexual life, I had to tell people that I had an STI. Right. So I got used to talking about this stuff at a really, really early age. And in my experience, if I told people right off the bat before we got sexual that I had an STI, it didn't really impact my sex life. Most people, as long as I didn't have an outbreak, most people were totally like, oh, that's great. Thank you so much for telling me. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And then can we have sex? Right. So I have a lot of lived experience that having an STI hasn't really affected my sex life negatively. And of the people, again, to go back to like, let's not let strangers impact how we feel about ourselves. I've had a few people say, oh, I'm not comfortable having sex with you. And then I would say, cool, thank you so much for letting me know. Is there something else that we can do instead? Do you want to watch a movie instead? Right? So pivoting away from the thing that I really was hoping to get, but also understanding that this is just someone's preference. Their preference is to not have sex with me because it's more risky to have sex with me than it is to have sex with somebody who doesn't have any STIs. That's another thing. The third thing is logically, I know, and because I've heard from many sex educator friends that I have that I called after I got herpes, and many of them said, oh, I prefer to have sex with people who know they have herpes because usually they're taking antivirals. They know the symptoms of when there's a herpes outbreak coming, like some sort of tingling or some sort of physiological response. And your risk might actually be lower from someone who's in tune with their body rather than someone who doesn't really know what the hell's going on, hasn't been tested in years. And there's also the fact that you can get herpes from someone who's asymptomatic, right? Who has no idea that they have herpes. So like in the grand scheme of things, am I going to let this affect my sex life? No, thanks.
Thanks for sharing that, man. I mean, I know it's not easy to talk about this stuff. And like you said, sometimes on the exterior, things look like they're going really well and that you're actually handling it like perfectly. But sometimes on the inside, like we just have this silent battle, right? Where we just struggle and struggle and struggle. And I think like you said, and this is like a common theme from what we've talked about, is that you have to be able to get to that place where you're hyper clear on what you want, who you are, what you stand for, and then being able to communicate that up front. And then once that person gives you an answer, whether that's negative or positive, you still maintain who you are. Like you walk away if that person isn't right for you, or they're going to, not, sleep with you because of whatever it is, because of you, having something that is an STI. I want to talk about something else that.
Okay, one more thing before we transition. I think it's really important to share with other people that you have an STI. Talk to your therapist, talk to your friends. You'll find out that you're not alone. That's the problem with this stuff, is that people think that they're alone and they're not. They so aren't. It's just that people aren't talking about it, right? So when I started telling people I had herpes, I found out that like half my friends had herpes too. And then we could talk about it, we could laugh about it. And that reduces shame. That's how we reduce the shame, is by not keeping it all to ourselves.
So what's the percentage of people that have it? Because I mean, I think at one point somebody told me that there was a percentage, and I forget the exact number, so I don't want to quote it, but it was a lot more than I thought. Like in your experience, do you know what it is?
I don't know. Someone said 20% for genital, like 60% for oral. So like, anyone who's ever had a cold sore or like a hot flash or whatever, whatever you call them on your lip, like that's a form of herpes, right? So like, but people don't talk about that. They don't share that. There's less stigma around oral herpes, mainly because people are calling it cold sores and because you can get it from your parents, during childbirth. So I don't know the numbers exactly, but they're high. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't really matter. What does matter is that you share with people that are safe people to share with what's going on for you. Whatever it is, whether it's STIs or heartbreak or depression or whatever, don't suffer silently.
For sure, don't suffer silently. And I know that there's another question I have now that you just kind of said that. So as far as timing and having some of these hard conversations, obviously, like if you're going to end up, especially like if you're going to sleep with somebody maybe sooner rather than later, like having the conversation about disclosing that you have an STI is obviously something you probably want to talk about very soon, right? But as far as like people, you see a lot of people sometimes oversharing past traumas, past relationships, like right off the bat, and they think that that's going to establish like some connection. And while it can, I think there can be some negatives too. Like, what are your thoughts on like timelines, generally speaking, as far as like how to bring up your past?
Yeah, that's a tough one. People really do love a good timeline, and I'm really hesitant to advise on any specific timelines for anything really. But I think, what you're describing is what I used to call people puking on my shoes in 12-step recovery. You're like, hey, what's up? How's it going? They're like, oh, this is, and they tell you like, my mom left me and, my dad was never around. And you're like, all right, dude, I was just asking you how you were doing like today, not like your whole life story. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that some people overshare because they think it's going to lead to connection. And I think that's right on. I really think that people are hoping for more of an emotional connection if they divulge these things. But also divulging too much too soon is actually a defense mechanism because it tends to push people away. Because people will be like, whoa, that was like TMI. That was TMI. So I think what we want is slowly over time. That's the barometer for these disclosures. And we do that because we don't know who we're disclosing to, right? You don't want to lead with something super intimate because that person could either make fun of you, use it against you, tell other people, because you don't know that they're a safe person to open up to, which is why we go slow. And by going slow, so you don't have to avoid all intimate disclosures. You could disclose something that you've processed. You could disclose something that's like not super close to your heart or that isn't like a really fresh wound and see how do they respond. Do they say something like, wow, that sounds really hard. Thank you for sharing. And then maybe take that opportunity to reciprocate. That's a good sign. If they're like, oh, that's lame, or they say like, that's not even a big deal, like, or they try to one up, you. These are all signs that like maybe this isn't the person that you want to be opening yourself up to. So I think we want to go slowly over time to figure out, is this someone that I really want to, do I want to stay close to? Do I want to let them into my life? I think I heard someone say, don't be giving people VIP tickets to the show right off the bat or backstage passes to your life slowly over time.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that it can do is you hear people will say, well, they already know so much about me, like I got to stick this out, right? They use it as an excuse to stay in the relationship because they've already opened up and shared like their entire past with that person, right? And they're like, well, they already know, and I've already told them this much, I've invested that, so I just got to see where this thing goes.
I've never heard that before, but I do know that people are reluctant to leave a relationship because they don't want to start over.
Right. Well, I've had experiences where people have overshared to me, and then I've ended up like walking away. And the pushback is like, I told you everything about my childhood. And I'm like, I know, like, I understand. I wasn't judging them for that. I just knew the relationship wasn't going to work out. But that was like their way, I think, of trying to get me back in, was being like, well, I just opened my heart to you. And so that's why I was sharing it, and that you don't want to end up using it as a way to somehow create this false connection. I think like we were talking about at the beginning, so that you can try and convince somebody to kind of stay with you that's not meant for you.
I mean, if you have a strong sense of self, that strategy is not going to work.
Right, exactly.
I'd be like, baby, girl, I'm sorry. This is still not a good fit regardless of what you shared with me. I feel for you and your past and wish you all the best, but this is still not a reason for me to stay into something that's like wildly out of alignment.
Absolutely. And I think there is like obviously some time where you want to be comfortable sharing stuff, but you want to make sure you're sharing from a place of authenticity and not because you're trying to like gain something connection wise from a relationship that's maybe you're already like not sure if it's going to end up working.
Well, and we do share for connection. So I still want to name the fact that like when we share, it is to get closer to somebody. As long as there's no ulterior motives, even though I had a sponsor say back in the day, at any given time, my motives are at half or at best half good. Right. So like he's only aware of like half of his motives and those are good. The other ones are sort of like unconscious motives that we carry around that we probably have a hard time being able to control.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think definitely like vulnerability is super important in order to create connection. Like you said, like we've kind of both said, that you just want to make sure that you're doing it from a place of authenticity and not just because you're trying to have some ulterior motive as far as, something in a relationship. These conversations, what they can do is they can help people like heal in relationships. A lot of times I think people, they end up getting out of a relationship and then they're like, all right, I'm going to take 6 months to like read books, follow this person on social media, and I'm going to heal, and then everything's going to be perfect. I'm going to get in a relationship and then everything works out. And I don't think that's necessarily how it works. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that people typically end up healing more in a relationship or outside of the relationship?
In a relationship is absolutely 100%, including the therapeutic relationship. So if you have a therapist, just that relationship, right, can be intensely healing, even if it's not a romantic one. I don't think that we should be jumping into relationships because we want to heal a whole bunch of stuff. Like, all right, I got these three things. I got my daddy leaving me. I got my mom who beat me. And I got, my ex who stole my identity. I'm going to deal with this in my next relationship. Like, I don't think that anyone should be doing that at all. I think that relationships are a potent vehicle for healing sort of some of the old unconscious stuff. And you don't know what it is until you're in the relationship. You don't know what's going to come up. You don't know which pattern or dynamic you're going to be replaying or repeating in your relationship until you're in it. So I think this maybe just serves as an invitation for people who are terrified of being in a relationship or who have been on the sidelines for a long time waiting to get better. This is maybe the invitation that it's okay for you to start going on dates and to evaluate whether being in a relationship is right for you, because that will slowly uncover other stuff that you can work on. Again, I think this is why we're looking for kind, loving people who understand that relationships are these vehicles for growth and for healing. And also why it's really important to have a therapist if you can afford one. And I really wish that therapy was more affordable in this country and in all countries. It should absolutely be a right, because it's hard being a human, especially a human in love or a human dealing with some of these wounds that are going to come up regardless of how much work you've done. The shit's going to come up. There's no one that's fully healed. Fully healed is dead.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think this part of the conversation kind of goes back to something that's like your bread and butter, which is like emotional availability. And a lot of times people, they will think that they've done some work on themselves, either, when they're out of a relationship for some time, or maybe they just have gotten to a place where they've been single for some time. They're like, all right, I got to finally actually do some work on myself so that I can open myself up again. And maybe they think that they're emotionally available, but really they're not. And then I think they'll end up attracting somebody who's emotionally unavailable. So based on what you teach and your experience, like what are some of the signs of somebody who's emotionally available? And if somebody's not emotionally available, like how can they get there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I just want to touch on this idea of, attracting emotionally unavailable people. I think that's a defense mechanism, right? If they don't open up, you don't open up, no one gets hurt, right? You might be disappointed. You might actually be the one that's doing the TMI thing, right? And then you can say, well, look, they weren't open. And so I did my best. I was really open and they ran away. And so they're not open. But really what you're doing is you're TMIing them into running away, right? So that's another form of unavailability. Paradoxically, being too open can be not open enough, right? Signs that someone is emotionally available could be they reciprocate with kindness when you have an emotional disclosure. They don't try to minimize or diminish your experience. They don't try to make fun of you or make light of your emotional disclosure. So let's say you share something about your grandmother passing away and how she was your favorite grandmother and it kind of feels like your mom is dead. They'll go, wow, that must sound really hard. You must really miss her. Can you tell me something? Tell me about how great she was, right? They're there for your emotional experience. They are able to use feeling words, I think is really nice, right? If, let's say, they tell you over dinner that they didn't get the job they applied for. And you can ask them, how does that make you feel? Right? If they're emotionally available, they might say, I was really disappointed. I really wanted that job and I really worked super hard for it. And I thought I was the right person for it. And yeah, my self-esteem's taken a bit of a hit. I'm feeling pretty sad and disappointed and a little discouraged, rather than saying, fuck, I didn't even want that job anyways. There's the differences between someone who might be more emotionally available and someone who might be a little bit more closed off. So those are some examples of how you can start identifying emotionally available people. I will say that I do caution and invite people to open up slowly over time. So you might meet someone that you think is actually closed off, but really what they're doing is they're taking their time. And so they're not closed off. They're slow to open up, which I think is fine. And you might meet people who wear their heart on their sleeve and who are puking on your shoes. And you might think are emotionally available, and actually they're not. They're just using that as a defense mechanism from building a healthy sort of connection with somebody.
Right. Yeah, because sometimes like what'll happen is somebody will puke on your your shoes. Like I like that. It's a funny analogy. And they'll end up just blaming everybody else but themselves, like for problems like, oh, my ex did this, my mom, my dad, my job. And then that becomes like a major turnoff, right? Because then that's like, to me, it's like a red flag and like, whoa, like I understand obviously people have their challenges, but off the bat, you're telling me all that. Like what's really going on?
That's a huge red flag. I think I'm going to add that to the list is that blames everybody else for anything that's ever happened to them, right? Because I think you and I are probably big into personal development and personal responsibility. And we kind of, like, I don't regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. I'm responsible for almost everything that's ever happened to me in my life, including all the unconscious decisions that I've made in the past, right? So I think that's a really good point, is to be wary of people who blame everybody and who aren't willing to clean up their side of the street and to take ownership for their responsibility and for their part in whatever the dynamic is.
Absolutely. And so like getting into like trying to do the inner work on themselves so that people can, get into a relationship, have a healthy relationship. You've obviously coached and talked to a lot of people. What are some of the like common beliefs that you think people have that end up holding them back?
Oh, that's a good question. Just one that comes up right off the bat is that I'm not worthy of love. And that's even one that I've struggled with, like up until like quite recently. It comes and it goes. I have struggled in the past and even in the very distant near past about feeling worthy of love. And even to the point where I was telling my friends that maybe I'll just, on my tombstone, it'll say, Shaun was really loved by his friends, because I just didn't feel worthy. And I think I have a lot of clients who feel like love is not for them, or that they missed out on the one, or they have like the one that got away, they'll never find love again. And in my experience, love is sort of like an infinite resource that will continue to come as long as you're open to it. And this feels a little hokey to say, but as human beings, we're all like deeply, deeply deserving of love. It's a birthright. It really is. But we all have a lot of work to do in sort of uncovering that belief that we're all worthy of it. And we do have a lot of coping mechanisms that maybe prevent us from being open to that kind of love, that have been in place to protect us from the hurt that we all invariably are going to experience as a result of being human, just because it's kind of messy and scary and a little hurtful. So that's the main one that I see, and the first that came to mind.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And thanks for also opening up about your own experiences with that. And this kind of, I think, parallels a little bit what we were talking about earlier, where a lot of times people come into a relationship or into dating and their view on love is jaded, or they're angry, or they're sad, or whatever. And they have to find a way to dig themselves out of that hole to come back to a place where they're feeling more open, loving towards other human beings. What have you found for yourself, I guess, that has helped you, like when you're feeling like unworthy of love, or you're in that thought pattern where you're like, is this really what it's going to say on my tombstone, where you're able to come back out and be able to, maybe take some steps to help get to a place where your mindset is now that you are worthy of love? What have you done that's helped?
Yeah, I mean, one beautiful practice is to have a photo of yourself as a small child on your desk or somewhere around your house, to remind yourself that like there's a little Shaun and a little Doug and a little Susie inside all of us that is pure, right? Like inside all of us is like a pure little child that just wants to love and to be loved. And so remember that no matter how beaten down by life you've been, and how many disappointing or hurtful or abusive, traumatic experiences you've had, that little person inside of you is still totally worthy of this, right? And that we've built up all these mechanisms over the years that kind of shield us from getting hurt, when all we really want is to be held and to be seen and to be heard and to be understood and to be cuddled, right? So just remember about this little person inside of you. I think that's one of the things that I try to remember as much as possible. And that's why this photo is right here by my desk. Yeah, that's one strategy that I employ a lot.
I love that, man. Like being able to remember who you are in a way, and remembering that we all have that kid inside of us, like you said, that deserves and is worthy of love. And I think the thing that most people struggle with this is when they've gone through a breakup and they're automatically like just down in a negative space. And a lot of times what happens is things happen like, all right, you see your ex move on too quick, they're having fun, they're doing all these things, and then this negative spiral just continues to get worse and worse and worse. What has helped you, or what advice do you give to people, to somebody that you're coaching, when they're in this negative downward spiral, fresh out of a breakup, and there's so much going on around them that just appears negative? Like, how do they be able to start to crawl out of that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, sharing with friends, feeling connected, rebuilding your support network, right? Because usually in a relationship, your partner becomes your main pillar of support and you have no safety net, right? They are the safety net. And then when they're gone, you're free falling. So get back to the work of slowly rebuilding your safety net, which means reconnecting with friends, doing things that make your body feel good, going to yoga, talking to people, hiring a therapist, like crying, right? So trying to move through all of the emotions that are going to come up, not minimizing any of them, right? Just like really being with your sadness, your desperation, your loneliness. So much loneliness after the relationship ends, usually for a lot of people. So yeah, I really recommend that people sort of dive into that darkness, because you have to clear the deck of all these emotions before you can kind of dig yourself out. And it's going to take a while, right? Sometimes it's going to take a lot longer than you want to be underwater. It kind of feels like you're underwater. And sometimes you're going to have to be in that space for longer than you want to be. And if you are in the unfortunate position of being with or seeing your ex move on faster than you, which is incredibly hurtful for a lot of people, try not to compare your insides to somebody's outsides. You've probably heard this in 12-step recovery, is that someone might look like they're doing well, but you have no idea what's going on with them. A lot of people can look at me and say like, Shaun's happy, he's killing it, he's successful, whatever. And inside I'm like, have been feeling pretty depressed for the last couple of years. And I don't share that, right? That's not what I show on social media. So you never really know what somebody's going through. So just because your ex looks like they're happy and they're in a new relationship with another hottie, that doesn't mean that they're actually happy. Also, it probably means that they haven't processed the breakup. They're just skipping to the next relationship because that is more interesting and more of a distraction than sitting with, why did this end? What's my part? How can I be different? How can I be better? Right? A lot of people don't ask themselves that, and they just sort of go to the next relationship. So those are a couple things, right? Dive in and try not to compare your experience to the experience of others. Heartbreak is going to sometimes take way longer than you want it to.
Yeah, what do they say also in the 12 steps? It's like control your side of the street, right? And keep your side of the street clean. Like make sure that you're controlling the controllables, doing your absolute best just to focus on yourself, rebuilding some of the other areas in your life that maybe like lacked a bit during the relationship, which I think is normal, and just giving yourself some grace and compassion, and accepting the fact that it's going to be freaking hard. Like breakups suck. Like it doesn't matter if you were with somebody that was great for you or bad for you. It's still hard no matter what.
Yeah, and if you have to sit on the couch with a pint of Ben and Jerry's every night of the week watching The Crown or whatever, that's what I'm watching these days, and binge watching some show and sobbing uncontrollably and burning all your photos of your ex, like fine, do that. Like do what you need to do to move through this thing that's probably going to take, quite a while if you're feeling pretty hurt about it.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's some great advice. Just don't be afraid to feel your feels and like sit in them for a bit. What do you think of attachment theory?
Useful to know. People are way too attached to their attachment style. Most of the people who are using attachment theory to self-diagnose themselves and others are not therapists or psychologists.
You've obviously talked to a lot of people about relationships. You drove, a cab, like we've talked about a couple times, and I'm sure you've been people in there that have opened up to you that have been married and in relationships for quite some time. What have you noticed are some of the common themes of people that have healthy relationships that last a long time?
Communication, obviously. Willing to work through conflict without stonewalling, without contempt, without being dismissive. The Gottmans have identified the 4 things that lead to long-lasting relationships. So I think being really good at repair is like paramount. And then staying playful, right? Like remembering that like this is your kind of your best friend, right? So like continuing to spend time and making the relationship a priority, regardless of the children, the businesses, the mortgage, all that other stuff is like staying connected. Those are the things that kind of come up on a regular basis.
I want to actually touch on those two of those things you just said, because obviously these two things are hard for people and they're both on opposite ends of the spectrum, is like conflict resolution. Like there's so many things out there about what to do. I know the Gottmans, I think they obviously, I think, talk about this, and like that you shouldn't, like, say certain things like you just said, but like what are your insights on like how somebody can navigate conflict in a way that's actually constructive?
I hate to be the guy that's like, go to couples counseling, but I'm the guy who's like, go to couples counseling, because I went to couples counseling when I was 23 years old with a girlfriend at the time, and we really loved each other and we could not resolve conflict. And as a result of that couples counseling, we actually broke up. I got sober. It was because of that I got sober. And so, I sometimes you can't dig yourself out of the hole. You need a third person there. That's one strategy. Another one is that like you can read books with your partner, you can do courses with your partner. There's a lot of stuff that you could do with your partner. And the third is, look, if you got some really deep-seated unhealed shit, you got to heal that stuff. It's not going to just go away.
For sure. Absolutely. Because I think a lot of times when people have unhealthy, conflict resolution methods, it's stuff that's stemmed from like childhood or past relationships or past patterns or whatever it is. I love that you brought that up. And actually the thing on remaining playful was actually a question that came into, like, I think what happens is we have this infatuation phase, the honeymoon phase of the relationship, where everything is like all well and good. And eventually like the dopamine high wears off, and now you're just like in like the normal relationship emotions. And people, I think, have a hard time like keeping the fire going. Like what are some of the things that you think people can do, maybe communication with each other or whatever, that helps keep that fire going?
I don't even know if it's about keeping the fire going. I think it's about grieving the end of that phase of the relationship, right? I think we're always in this grieving process of letting go of old versions of ourselves or old dynamics in a relationship. But that grief will actually lead to a different kind of fire. Maybe it's a slower burn. Maybe it's a more intense burn. Maybe it's something that feels hotter but less big, or bigger but less hot, So it's less about maintaining that fire, and it's more about sort of dancing with the flames and dancing with sort of the changes of the relationship. Because usually when the honeymoon period ends, you enter a deepening phase. You enter something that's more grounded, that's more secure, that's less scary, that you can sleep well together, that's less like anxiety inducing. And that can be deeply, deeply beautiful as well. So it's more about grieving the infatuation or the honeymoon phase, and then also welcoming in, how is this relationship going to change? Because they're all going to change.
Right. Yeah, it's true. Because I think a lot of times in my experience, when I've gotten into a relationship and it's like super good at the beginning, and then it's not the same. It's like, well, what happened? Did I just not like this person anymore? But you have to realize you got to you have to understand that and accept that, like you said, grieve that, and then continue to communicate that with your partner to progress things.
Yeah, and find different ways of connecting. And I think talking about the fact that your feelings are changing, that they may be deepening or they may be less exciting, is totally fine. I think, get used to talking about the relationship in your relationship on a regular basis will yield dividends for the rest of your life.
Communication, man. It's like,
I hate it. I hate it. It's also my background.
It's been like the theme of our conversation, and I think people are going to get a lot of value out of this. I mean, you got really real. You were vulnerable. You were tactical. Gave some good tips for people, and I think people are going to get a lot out of your message, man. So I want to thank you once again for coming on and for being so open. If people want to connect with you, if they want to learn more about your courses and some of the stuff that you have to offer, where's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at The Love Drive, or my website. All my courses live there. The link in my bio on Instagram has everything, but my website's shaungalanos.com. And I have a podcast called The Love Drive Podcast. So if you like podcasts on love and relationships and healthy communication and all that kind of stuff, you can find that there. And I just want to thank you for having me on, man. I think this was, you're a fantastic interviewer, super connected. Your questions are awesome. It was really fun to jam with you, and, honored to spend this hour with you.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. And it means a lot because, as somebody, I know you're a podcaster as well. And your background, like you said, is in communication. So I appreciate the kind words. So what I invite people to do is to share a takeaway, because Shaun shared a lot. We talked about a lot, whether that was something that he said about just being real and being true to yourself, and how he opened up and shared about being diagnosed with herpes. Maybe it was something that he shared about like love, like how to actually get to a place where you're ready to love again. Maybe it was something he said about breakups, maybe something he said about like when it's time to like walk away, when we talked about emotional needs, if that resonated with you, or perhaps it was when we talked about emotional availability. Whatever the takeaway was, make sure to tag Shaun, tag myself, because we'd love to hear your feedback. And we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and we'll see you next time.